بعرفش إذا في حدا مسؤول بشكل مباشر عن الكوارث الطبيعية اللي بالنسبة إلي يعني زي الزلازل. بعرفش إذا عن جد بيكون عن جد لهالدرجة ممكن يكون الإنسان بيأثر.
Natural disasters, nature, surely. You know, earthquakes, plate shifts, humans can't control that. Creates a tsunami, you can't stop a tsunami. It's nature, it's in the name.
Somebody can associate with God's angriness.
يعني بتخيل إنه الأرض عم تعطينا إشارة عم بتقولنا إنه خلص إنه نوقف إنه نريحها.
Natural disasters, I'm not so sure it's natural. Most of it's man-made.
حتى كمان العمران اللي عم بيصير في بعض الدول كمان هذا بيأثر كمان على الزلازل وعلى الفيضانات خاصة نوعية البناء اللي بيتم استخدامه.
Cuando nosotros construimos, por ejemplo, en zonas por las que sí o sí tiene que pasar un caudal, es donde ocurre un desbordamiento. No están preparadas para viviendas.
O también ya un tema más corporativo, ¿no? Las grandes empresas que no quieren hacer las cosas bien éticamente.
We want to blame the rich, but we're in it too.
There are many ways to describe the vast destruction we've seen in recent years as cyclones, bushfires and droughts have swept through different countries around the world.
You would be justified calling their impact frightening. Hurricane Patricia in 2015 was the most powerful tropical cyclone on record in terms of wind speed, at 345 kilometres an hour. You could call the aftermath unprecedented. The 2020 bushfires in Australia resulted in more than 24 million hectares burned and billions of animals killed or displaced. You might call the losses devastating, especially when you consider that more than 50,000 people were killed and more than 14 million affected by the earthquake across Turkey and Syria in 2023.
But whatever you call these disasters, they shouldn't be called exclusively natural.
It's a natural disaster.
Natural disaster.
2023 वाकई natural disasters का year होगा.
Natural disasters. How will China battle these natural disasters?
Yes, typhoons, floods, earthquakes, they are hazardous incidents occurring in nature. But a variety of human factors means their intensity and impact isn't purely natural.
Extreme weather events like floods, cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, heat waves, calling them natural, calling them God-given is until now quite legitimate. But we have now entered into a new era.
Dr. Saleemul Huq was director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. He also served as senior advisor for the Least Developed Countries Group at the United Nations. Our interview was filmed a few months before he passed away in October 2023.
What has happened since the Industrial Revolution is that we have been spewing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that has resulted in the temperature of the atmosphere going up by well over 1 degree centigrade already. And we are seeing the consequences of that. The floods we used to have are getting more severe.
It's the worst flooding the city has seen for at least a decade.
The cyclones we used to have are getting more severe.
Cyclone Gabrielle is the most significant weather event New Zealand has seen this century.
The heat waves we used to have are getting more severe.
July is slated to become the world's hottest month.
So while the events themselves are not caused by human-induced climate change, they are exacerbated. They are made more intense. They're made worse.
Often, if you look carefully at those narratives, you can see that they're deployed sometimes by politicians.
Αλλά αντιμετωπίζουμε μια φυσική καταστροφή πρωτόγνωρων διαστάσεων.
En reconnaissance de l'état de catastrophe naturelle.
They are natural disasters and they wreak this sort of havoc.
And it's this idea that there are events that are beyond our control. And we know increasingly, because of the climate science, that that is untrue.
Dr. Siobhan McDonnell is a lawyer and legal anthropologist with over 20 years' experience working with Indigenous people in Australia and Oceania on climate change issues.
There are various climate reasons why we're facing these dramatic changes to weather events across the globe. And it isn't this kind of ephemeral Mother Nature.
When Mother Nature strikes,
Mother Nature wreaks havoc.
Mother Nature will do what she does.
We all have responsibility, and by labelling it Mother Nature or natural, we are obscuring the political choices and the geopolitics that sit underneath these sets of events.
Whether to call a disaster natural or not may seem like a semantic argument. After all, who cares what you call it if it makes no difference to the impact on people, animals and property? The thing is, yes, this is a semantic argument, but it's not just about labels or words. It's about accountability. Human choices and actions have meant that many natural hazards now lead to record-breaking levels of destruction. They have a huge impact on who lives and who dies, or who is injured or left homeless after an event.
Earthquakes kill people, but it's badly located and poorly made buildings and bridges that really spike the numbers of deaths. A crude measure the difference human choices make would be to compare the difference in the death rates for similar natural phenomena in different countries. In January 2010, a magnitude 7 earthquake hit Haiti, killing more than 300,000 people. 1 month later, a stronger magnitude 8.8 earthquake and tsunami struck Chile, but killed far fewer people, with 525 deaths officially reported. There were multiple reasons for the enormous differences between the quakes, but in Haiti, substandard engineering, poor quality materials, and almost no disaster relief services all played a significant role in the extent of the devastation. I asked Saleem how climate vulnerabilities are not just different between rich and poor countries, but between the rich and poor living within wealthy countries.
No matter whether it's a poor country or a rich country, you will find that the poorer citizens tend to be located in the more hazard-prone areas, the places that do not get services as much as the richer places do. And so it reinforces their vulnerability, it reinforces their poverty, and sometimes these are institutionalized. In the United States, for example, blacks were put in areas where whites would not live. And this was enforced both legally and by just common practice of the housing industry. And so when you see the death toll of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, many of the approximately 1,200 people who lost their lives were poor blacks living in the Ninth Ward.
The center of New Orleans, not hit as hard as some might have thought, but when you get outside of that area to the poorer areas of New Orleans in particular, there is so much devastation.
The impacts are going to happen whether we like them or not. How big they're going to be or how bad they're going to be is a function of how well prepared we were or we were not.
Helping people in hazard-prone areas get prepared is high on the list for many climate justice groups. Mitzi Tan lives in the Philippines. She is an international spokesperson for the youth climate advocacy group Fridays for Future. She is also the organiser for its Most Affected Peoples and Areas subcommittee.
So MAPA, or Most Affected Peoples and Areas, is kind of like the global south arm of Fridays for Futures.
The youth alongside the most impacted communities are standing up against this injustice.
It includes the BIPOC, the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in the global north, such as the communities in Australia that have been impacted the most by the climate crisis. Because we realize the climate crisis intersects with all the other socioeconomic crises, sexism, class inequality especially, racism, ableism, all these things, they get amplified by the climate crisis. So really, it's a spectrum of privilege and of vulnerability and of responsibility.
So Mitzi, how does extreme weather contribute to gender inequality?
Because majority of the world's poor are women. Women are among the most vulnerable to the climate crisis. In the Philippines, a very concrete example is how in 2013, Typhoon Haiyan devastated our country. And for years after that, young women and young girls were forced into prostitution because of the economic devastation of our communities. And that's not just happening in the Philippines, it's happening across the world in global south countries that aren't able to bounce back after the extreme weather event.
We know that richer countries are much more able to cope with climate impacts than poorer countries. But even internal to those countries, different households are better able in terms of coping with what are increasingly cascading disasters. It's Black Summer in Australia, massive fires, then it's COVID, then it's something else. Are you the kind of household that can cope, or are you a poor household that is already struggling and is pushed down by the first disaster and can no longer regain your footing? This is the new poverty.
There's a fairly well-established template for how we talk about the damage that's left behind in the wake of extreme weather events.
Es ist erschreckend. Ich will fast sagen, die deutsche Sprache kennt kaum Worte für die Verwüstung, die angerichtet ist.
Δυστυχώς, τα δύσκολα είναι ακόμα μπροστά μας. Και η νύχτα που έρχεται είναι απειλητική.
Be prepared for the worst because the worst continues to happen.
Unsurprisingly, doom is a big part of the response. The sheer power of the elements, the scale of the destruction, all of that features in political narratives. It's at the top of the news headlines, and it shapes how we think about worsening climate-related events.
Across Australia, heat records are smashed.
Normal life has been completely disrupted.
Cyclone Harold is battering Vanuatu.
Surface temperatures have reached 60 Celsius in places.
There are cars upside down. It is really quite apocalyptic.
What's tougher to capture in these discussions are the complex factors that turn natural hazards into disasters, placing some more at risk than others.
It's difficult really to know what the impact of all of these apocalyptic images around fire and flooding. I don't want to detract from the impact, the experience that people face from disasters is pressing and real. I think what we need to focus on is when the media depicts these images in this way, what happens to people's experience of their own agency? And how do people understand the broader political choices that states are making to act or not act on climate change, particularly those of us who are in carbon emitting countries?
I've seen in the Philippines, some people get desensitized to the typhoons that we've experienced because sometimes it's easier than having to dwell on how every year our communities just get consumed completely by floods. The way that we try to change this is again by telling them that the climate crisis isn't just something that happens. It is something that is happening to us. It is being done to us.
There are some hard choices and dramatic changes needed if we want to get serious about slowing the rate at which our planet systems are buckling. It seems, though, that the big institutions, the nations responsible for making these crucial calls, are relying too heavily on strategies of climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience.
The people of Puerto Rico keep getting back up with resilience.
An ambitious plan to take strong action to fight and build resilience.
Help them to adapt and to build resilience.
But what really worries me is that it's very much directed, particularly where I work in the Pacific, at local Pacific villages, that they're somehow supposed to cultivate more resilience. And even in Australia, that we're supposed to bounce back, that we're supposed to be resilient to climate change impacts.
And that is the resilience and the adaptation that we need in our community, right across the country, to deal with longer, hotter, drier seasons that increase the risk of bushfire.
And what all of this fails to say is that there are choices being made by companies to put fossil fuels into the environment, that there are political choices being made not to address what is a carbon emission problem.
Australia's Prime Minister has visited towns damaged by the fires, but says he's committed to protecting mining jobs.
You will also not reduce the number of coal-fired power stations in the world today by forcing the shutdown of Australian coal mines and Australian jobs that go with them.
And in the Pacific, no amount of resilience is going to help people with the incredible impact of 3 cyclones at a Category 5 level in 5 years. So this narrative of resilience is placing the responsibility on local people, whereas really these are big geopolitical choices that are influencing their lives.
In the huge amounts of media coverage that gets churned out after disasters, it is justifiable that there's a big focus on human suffering.
I'm helping to find the victims. I know there are more bodies that are still buried.
The rescuers just say, if we can't hear anyone, we can't help. And then they leave.
Can you actually cope with this, with the scale of it?
I don't know.
However, this is the moment in which people are looking for explanations for why extreme weather events are getting so severe.
Climate change is making cyclones more intense.
Global warming is exacerbating the adverse weather.
Record rainfall across Germany and Belgium last month, that was made up to 9 times more likely by the climate crisis.
Journalists are getting better at this, but in these urgent times, the reporting has to be sharper and get at the root cause of the climate crisis.
I definitely think that we need more focus on the fossil fuel industry when the media is talking about the climate crisis. In the Philippines, I'm still not seeing the culprits behind the climate crisis. So it seems like the climate crisis or climate change is just a natural act of God.
Why is extreme weather happening in this part of the globe?
The more heat there is, the more stronger yung typhoon. And so that's why we're seeing increasing typhoons.
And the ways that we can stop it is still not being talked about as much. And that is so dangerous because then you give people only half of the information and not the information that's crucial to make them act.
The average weather person is knowledgeable about weather, which is very short term. It's what's going to happen in the next 24 hours. They are not particularly well versed on long-term climate changes. When there's an extreme event, whether it's a tornado or a wildfire or a heavy rainfall, journalists, they owe their audience an explanation of who are causing that and why it's happening, and then say that there are things we can do to prevent it happening.
In 2016, a campaign began in Australia, a climate emergency campaign. With all indicators for the health of the planet trending downwards, there was a need to jolt humanity into action. The first announcement of a climate emergency was in December 2016, here in the city of Darebin in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. Since then, more than 2,100 local governments in 39 countries have declared a state of climate emergency. The question is, how effective are these declarations at galvanising action?
What I saw with the emergency term, it helped change people's minds, not the government's minds, but it helped people realize that this is something that's happening, it is alarming, and we have to do something. The next step is to make sure people understand why it's happening, and it's connecting the fossil fuel industry to the climate emergency.
When the COVID pandemic happened, there was meaningful, urgent action. I mean, it was a real emergency response. Do you think, having seen that, world leaders even think of climate as an emergency?
I don't think that world leaders really thought of the climate crisis as an emergency because we saw how fast the response was when it was the COVID pandemic. And the question here is, why is the COVID pandemic different from the climate crisis? It's because the COVID pandemic can reach the US president. The COVID pandemic can reach the fossil fuel industry. It's something that threatens them, and that's why the response was so widespread and fast. But if it wasn't something that threatens them, because there are diseases that are still killing people today, but it's being ignored because it's not a threat to the rich old white man in power.
For decades, poor and vulnerable people have borne the brunt of the climate crisis. However, as unpredictability and danger has inched closer and closer to wealthy communities and countries, it's become clear that nowhere is safe in a world run on fossil fuels. It has taken global media a while to catch up with this reality.
In the last years, we've seen events taking place in developed countries like floods in Germany and hurricanes in the US, etc. They get far more global media coverage than developing countries. The countries of Madagascar and Mozambique, in a matter of 3 weeks, got hit by 3 successive cyclones, killed hundreds of people, made tens of thousands of homeless. So who is affected matters to the so-called global media. It's very northern media. The reporting, therefore, reflects their inherent biases.
You don't expect people to die in a flood in Germany. You expect it maybe in poor countries, but you don't expect it here.
You can imagine this sort of thing happening in Asia, but not here.
The emergency happens when it happens to you. And when it happens in a rich country, then it gets coverage. And then political leaders have to do something because it's their own citizens who are being affected.
There was a time when I was talking to a journalist and I said that the Philippines has the highest number of extreme weather events in the past 20 years. And they said, oh, so it's normal for you now. It's not supposed to be seen as normal, but instead something that shouldn't be happening to anyone. That's exactly why the climate crisis keeps being seen as a problem of the future and not a problem of today, because they think that as long as it's not being experienced by them, especially by the global north leaders, that it's okay because it's not a pressing issue yet. I've been on panels with climate activists from the global north and then me from the global south, and all the questions about the solutions are only asked to them. And I only get to talk about the impacts, the experiences, the trauma, the sad part. And so while I know it's so important to communicate the impacts of the climate crisis and the impacts of extreme weather events, every opportunity I have, I always love to talk about the solutions.
Bangladesh has one of the best flood forecasting, certainly the best cyclone forecasting and evacuation in the whole world. We can warn and evacuate more than 3 million people. We have school kids who are trained and mobilized to make sure that nobody's left behind. They go house to house, they bring the widows and the old people to the shelter. Now, that doesn't mean that the cyclone doesn't cause a lot of damage. It does. But people don't die anymore.
Over the past 3 decades, the global climate crisis response has moved through different phases. First, there was the mitigation approach. Commitments were made to drastically reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and to protect the Earth's ozone.
From now on, industrialized countries that are party to the protocol have a clear obligation to reduce emissions.
Some serious steps were taken, but the action wasn't concerted enough or consistent enough. The second phase was about adaptation. There was an acceptance, a resignation to the reality of climate breakdown. Governments realised they needed to prepare vulnerable areas and populations for the impacts.
The Adaptation Fund would benefit from additional financing this year. This is critical for developing countries which urgently need assistance to cope with increasing climate change impacts.
Now we're in the phase where the main focus is on loss and damage, trying to put a figure on the destruction faced by countries suffering erosion, fires, floods and degradation as a result of the climate crisis.
So things like in the Pacific Islands, at a point in time, sea level rise will have impacts that cannot be adapted to, and that will cause loss and damage impacts that will result potentially in climate migration and displacement.
Forced displacement because of climate change is now a well-recognized phenomenon. In Bangladesh, where I sit, it's happening. In the low-lying coastal zone of the country, people are simply not able to continue to live there because of salinity intrusion, loss of their land.
I mean, no one has begun to document loss of cultural production due to climate change impact. Let's talk about loss of languages, loss of identity. All of these things happen when you lose attachment to place. There are huge and dramatic potential transformations taking place through absolutely no fault of their own, right? Pacific Islanders produce very little carbon emissions whatsoever.
Loss and damage and the question of climate financing has become a bigger and more urgent subject of debate. You can see it with each passing COP gathering, especially COP26 at Glasgow and COP27 in Egypt. In fact, in Egypt, the establishment of a loss and damage fund was seen as a huge win. But the battle is far from over. Siobhan has been at enough negotiating tables to know.
Pacific Island countries, Caribbean countries have for 20 years plus asked for climate finance to address loss and damage impacts. This became a huge issue in COP26. I drafted a Pacific position that got supported by the whole of the Global South, G77, and was heavily resisted by the United States. Never think that climate science is just science. Everything is political.
That $100 billion includes climate finance in the form of loans and not in the form of grants. Why should we have to go into debt to your countries when you caused the reason why we have to borrow money?
When the floods happened in Germany, the then Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, visited the flood victims, and she immediately gave them in the order of 500 million euros for loss and damage that they had suffered. Similarly, in the United States of America, when Hurricane Ida killed more than 50 American citizens. President Biden visited them and acknowledged this was probably climate change and provided about $50 million as loss and damage compensation for them. Now, these are perfectly good, respectable things that leaders should do. But when Angela Merkel came to Glasgow and Joe Biden came to Glasgow and we, the developing countries, asked for money, they didn't give us a single cent.
The notion of natural disasters comes with a set of visuals. Not only are these disasters not solely natural, the visuals should be entirely different. They should be scenes from COP after COP, where oil and gas lobbyists get to alter key commitments on emissions reductions. The footage that should play after a devastating earthquake should be of big real estate developers signing off on shoddy materials and building standards. And as island nations grapple with coastal erosion, we should also see images of rampant mining for sand and minerals along coasts. None of these would work for the kind of breathless coverage we see of climate events, but they certainly would be much more relevant visuals. After all, these disasters are caused by human choices that enable and even reward human-induced climate change. This has happened for decades now, generation after generation, and the burden of both the natural devastation and the need for corrective action has fallen on ever younger people.
When I talk to young people nowadays in any country, including my own, I tell them that as of now, your responsibility is to be a global citizen first and a citizen of your own country second. This is a global solidarity movement of young people. We haven't seen that from the politicians. They came to Glasgow, they decided, well, not much of an emergency here as far as we can see. And then, Greta Thunberg was out on the street shouting and the kids were on the street shouting.
This is what leadership looks like.
They didn't listen. They came in on their jets, they made a speech and they flew out on their jets. And for them, it was business as usual. So change is difficult. Change takes time. Hopefully, with new generations of people being better educated, we will see less prejudice. And that's the way forward, in my view, to tackle many of the injustices.
If young people from across the world can collaborate together, why can't our world leaders collaborate? We have to mitigate the risks at the same time, tracing out the roots to the climate crisis, which are colonialism and imperialism and this profit-oriented system that we have. And so the only way to really solve the climate crisis is to change the system. But while we're doing that, we have to make sure that we mitigate the risks and get rid of the fossil fuel industry and change as much as we can right now.
Thanks so much for watching this episode of All How the Planet, a series looking at the forces undermining meaningful action on the climate crisis. If you're interested in more content around the themes that we're talking about, we've actually created an interactive long form, which is available on aljazeera.com. Otherwise, if you want to check out any of the other episodes, you can use the hashtag AllHowThePlanet on social media.